Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me go back to General Dayton. General Dayton, just so I understand, your is it your view that if confirmed, your responsibility as the U.S. ambassador is to not only report and share information with the executive branch, but also Congress?
Of course, Senator, I do believe that. And let me clarify something for both you and Senator Murphy, if I may. The questions originally came in about Mr. Giuliani, and I'd like to put Mr. Giuliani off to the side for a second. If I, as the U.S. ambassador in Kyiv, have any indication that there is any kind of election interference going on using Ukraine as a lever to do that, I would, of course, report that directly to this committee. I think you have a right to know that. I think I have an obligation to report that to you. I hope I didn't make it unclear. What I was trying to say was that, you know, if somebody wants to see me, I'll critically assess. But as far as the responsibilities of this committee, in a case like that, I agree with you on that.
Well, I appreciate that additional clarification. It's very helpful. Let me ask you this on two substantive questions. If Congress was to pass additional legislation to increase security assistance for Ukraine, what sectors of the Ukrainian security forces would you propose be strengthened?
It's a great question, Senator, and we're already working on it. The answer is the Navy, and the answer is the Air Force. Those are the two sectors that need the most work. And we are already working on that largely through the generosity of your committee in the U.S. Senate. The Ukrainians have the ability now to deal with some of the things in coastal patrol, maritime domain awareness that are very, very important. And as I said earlier, the Black Sea, in my view, will become an increasingly important area for all of us to be looking at strategically.
Okay, and then finally, it's a developing democracy, and there remain significant reform challenges. If confirmed, what would be your priorities on reform and your plan to see them come to fruition?
I would tell you that it's probably what I would call rule of law and the judiciary. You're right, it's an emerging democracy. It's not there yet. It's working very hard. I get a lot of young Ukrainians here at the Marshall Center who are very idealistic, working in these areas of countering corruption and countering the old ways. And they tell me almost to a person that it's the judiciary that is the problem, that they can come up with cases to put before the judiciary, and the cases are either dismissed or they're delayed for so long that they are no longer meaningful. This is an area that I think is very, very important, and it will be probably my #1 priority if I were confirmed.
Well, thank you very much for those answers. Ms. Barber, let me go back to you. On the issue of women's rights and empowerment, can you provide us with your understanding of whether women can meaningfully participate in the economy if they are not able to have autonomous control of their own bodies supported by comprehensive access to sexual and reproductive health?
Senator, I will say that the United States has historically and continues to be the largest contributor for programs that help women and children, the health and wellness of women. And I believe that we continue to support women's health.
Okay, you're a very capable attorney, from what I'm told. Let me repeat my question. On this issue of women's rights and empowerment, the question goes to: can a woman, from your perspective as someone who is going to be at ECOSOC and be involved with these issues, can they meaningfully participate in the economy if they're not able to have autonomous control of their own bodies, supported by comprehensive access to sexual and reproductive health? Yes? No?
Senator, I would say that it's a difficult question to answer, but I believe that women, we need to help women find ways to meaningfully participate in their economies. And I think that they can, but I think that in some countries, they need help. And if confirmed, I look forward to adding my voice to the United States efforts that already exist to helping women.
Well, I appreciate that, but here's the problem. You know, you're going to be in a position in which the issues that I have just raised with you are going to be a significant part of your portfolio. You may want to skirt them with me. You may not want to offend somebody who maybe has been part of your nominating process, but you will be representing the totality of the United States of America. And our law has been very clear in this regard. Our pursuits, our engagement has been very clear in this regard. So you leave me unnerved by your answer. Let me ask you this. Will you commit to complying with the Solgender Amendment prohibition on lobbying for or against abortions in multilateral forums? I can't hear you. Can you put your microphone on?
Yes, Senator.
Thank you. All right. Let me turn to Mr. Wong. Mr. Wong, over the past several years, the U.S. has taken actions that have downgraded its engagement with a number of critical UN bodies and peacekeeping UN bodies and programs. It's racked up nearly $1 billion in arrears on its UN peacekeeping dues, withdrawn from the UN Human Rights Council, withheld funding for the UN Human Rights Office, abrogated its participation in other UN institutions and initiatives, including the Paris Agreement, most recently submitted paperwork to withdraw the United States from the World Health Organization in the midst of the global pandemic. So, as someone who's being nominated to participate in probably the premier multilateral forum, do you agree with these decisions to withdraw from key multilateral bodies at a time in which the world faces enormous global issues?
Sarah, thank you for the question. Let me just start by saying I think the UN is a vital institution. I think the UN system, largely due to U.S. leadership and in U.S. funding over the decades, has developed a number of institutions to benefit not just U.S. interests, but to support the UN Charter, namely speaking of peacekeeping operations, World Food Program, UNICEF, counterterrorism bodies, a whole phalanx of bodies that we support and we continue to lead and are the #1 funder of. Now, you've talked about withdrawal from certain organizations. I do think when there's an organization that does not abide by the UN Charter, which does not live up to its principles, where reform or the path to reform is not available with continued U.S. participation, withdrawal should be considered because it is a strong incentive for reform to get those bodies up to, again, fulfilling the principles in their missions as well as the UN Charter. But putting aside withdrawal, which is a decision not to be taken lightly, we do need concerted diplomacy, concerted U.S. leadership to galvanize our like-mindeds, to blunt damaging initiatives, but also to reform and keep these organizations honest to the UN Charter.
Well, let me just take your explanation to a logical conclusion. Let's assume that, just for the sake of argument, that every entity within the UN body is one in which you make the decision that, in fact, we cannot, by our participation, seek and achieve the reform that we want. Then what's the use of being part of the United Nations?
Sir, thank you for your question. I don't think that's the case with the grand majority of organizations that we support. Again, I do think the UN system is a vital institution that fulfills not just our interests, but again, the interest of our friends and allies and of the interests of people around the world that is in the UN Charter. So I don't think we're there with the grand majority of organizations, but we'll continue to do the work to ensure that the organizations across the UN system, but particularly in my portfolio in the security space, in the peacekeeping space, that those do remain faithful to the Charter, that those do advance global interests and do not compromise the principles that all countries signed up to when they signed up for the UN Charter.
Well, I worry that when we recede, China accedes and ultimately fills in the space and seeks to mold the institution in its own desire. And so it's a real concern as we move forward. But let me talk about peacekeeping, since you just raised that particularly in your portfolio. Do you agree that peacekeeping operations are an important example of burden sharing by countries across the globe?
I do agree with that, sir.
And if confirmed, will you work to ensure that peacekeeping operations continue to prominently feature in the UN's efforts to mitigate conflict?
I do, sir.
But what happens when we promote those views, which I agree with you on, I agree with your answers, particularly to our allies when we fail to honor our financial commitments to missions that we ourselves have voted for on the Security Council?
Senator, thank you for the question. I agree with you that peacekeeping operations have to be appropriately funded so they can complete their missions. They need to be effective to create stability in terms of security so we can hand it off to have ultimate political stability in these hotspots around the world. Now, you've mentioned arrears, you've mentioned funding. I do want to note the United States remains by far the #1 funder of peacekeeping operations around the world. But we do abide by the policy, and I think a legislative policy, that we should not fund more than 1/4 or 25% of the budget. I think our assessment, if my numbers are correct, is around 27.8 or 28%. So we are falling short of that. That's because of, I think, a very reasonable policy. We supply more than, but we supply 1/4 of these funding of these funds. We do think other countries should step up. There are 193 member states of the United Nations. We do take on a lot of the burden because we are the world's leader. We are the world's only superpower. But I think 25% is a reasonable number. But look, I look forward, if I'm to be confirmed, sir, on engaging on this issue and continuing the consultation with you and your office, as well as this committee, on this important issue.
I just think we have a real concern when we at the Security Council vote for peacekeeping operations, and then we fall in arrears of our commitments. So even if we are the largest, then if we think that a peacekeeping operation is in the national interest of the United States, then we have to see that its mission can be achieved. So I appreciate your global answer, but this is going to be a continuing issue as to how we cast our vote and then how we ultimately deal with the mission itself in terms of its funding. Let me finally turn to Mr. Burrier and our nominee for Belarus. Mr. Barber, do you believe that it's appropriate for the DFC to be undertaking domestic supply chain issues?
Senator, as you know, the president signed an executive order to give us that limited 2-year authority. I'm comforted by the fact that we have structured that so that that authority is going to take place under the Defense Production Act and not compete with the resources for the DFC in our international mission, which I'm committed to.
Yeah, well, when I helped create the DFC, I can tell you it's not what I was supportive of creating to do. The DFC is an international development role. And I don't expect, not only was it's not in its mandate, I don't expect that the staff and resources are going to be used to take away from the congressionally mandated mission. And so I'm seriously concerned about that. I'm also concerned, I successfully fought to include OPIC's environmental and social policy statement transferred to the DFC. I need to understand how the DFE published a new ESPS that looks very different from the ESPS that Section 606 of the BUILD Act was supposed to transfer. I need you to explain how these changes were made without violating Section 606. I don't have anything against nuclear power. It exists in New Jersey. But I'm very skeptical of the DFC's new policy to consider proposals to build nuclear power plants in developing countries regarding security, environmental concerns, long-term debt, management constraints that nuclear plants would be crippling to many developing countries. So explain to me how what you all did as it relates to that provision doesn't violate what the law actually says.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Senator. And I've worked with your staff on that provision. Section 1466 of the BUILD Act did transfer OPIC's environmental policy to the DFC. Since that time, we did voluntarily notice for a period of public and comment a proposed change to the OPIC's nuclear policy. That was a voluntary effort on our end. We thought that it made sense that since BUILD Act was part of modernizing our development finance capabilities, to see if it made sense to take a fresh look at that policy. We heard from many members of the committee, got a lot of support for that change to allow us to consider nuclear projects. But I want to assure you that that does not change the countries that we would operate in or our developmental mandate. We believe strongly that energy is a key driver of economic development and see a role for the modern small medium reactors that are coming online in the future, and want to work closely with the committee as that policy develops to ensure that you have the information you need.
Well, if you're confirmed, but I will follow up with the agency no matter what, but if you're confirmed, I definitely want to follow up with you to make sure that what was the law maintains not only in its actions, but in its spirit as well. And finally, if I may, Mr.
Thank you.
Ms. Fischer, let me ask you, we rejoice in seeing the movement that Belarus is taking, but the president of Belarus may be moving away from Moscow, but he's clearly not moving towards democracy. Do you agree with the principles that were laid out in the Belarus Democracy Act?
Yes, sir, I do.
You know, how should the United States approach the issues of sanctions with respect to Belarus?
Senator, I would urge that we approach them carefully. I would not support any hasty judgments to move on sanctions. I think they were put in place for specific concrete reasons, and the absence of progress in those areas, we should, I would suggest, consult very carefully between the administration and this committee as to our assessments and our judgments of progress that we may or may not see with regards to those conditions.
Let me phrase it this way. Do you agree with the current posture where sanctions are suspended but could snap back in the event of a regime crackdown?
I think that the suspension of those sanctions has been a very useful tool in this moment. And I do believe that they are something that they are a very valuable tool for us should we see steps backwards. It's very hard for me to predict when, if, what are the precise conditions under which we would do that, particularly given how challenging it will be to understand conditions on the ground in the coming days and weeks. With the lack of observer missions, the limited number of people who will be observing these elections, but the suspension is a very useful tool for us. Yes, sir.
And finally, how do you intend to engage, if you're confirmed, with the Belarusian government on issues like more competitive democratic elections and ending politically motivated detentions? What specific actions do you think we should prioritize in responding to those problems?
I think, sir, my own experience in this part of the world tells me that we have the most important thing we do is we have an honest and a direct conversation with a range of authorities. In Belarus, there is one person whose opinion matters most, but helping to build confidence to make progress in these areas and seeing this as a step that helps ensure Belarus's sovereignty and independence, I think is an effort that takes time and it takes repeated engagement and conversations. I think the importance of a message that is unified from Washington, and I think we have had really out of Washington, we have spoken very clearly, I think, with one voice, and that's been very useful. The statement from Senators Rubio and Cardin and Durbin on the conduct of the elections, in addition to Secretary Pompeo's statement, in addition to what our embassy in Minsk has put out, that is incredibly important as Belarus makes a calculation about its own standing. And Belarus has been very clear that they are seeking further engagement with the West. Well, just as it's very clear how many strings are attached to Moscow's engagement in Belarus. It's also clear the high costs of doing business with Belarus. But for us in the West, and not just the United States, but for us in the West, seeing Belarus make progress in these areas it's absolutely essential.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You have been true to your word. You've been very generous with the time. I appreciate it, considering the size of the panel.